I would like, if I may, to take you on a strange journey.
Greetings, welcome to the Cultworthy Cinema Podcast. I'm your host, Antonio, and I have a very special guest today, returning to the show for like the fourth or fifth time, my good friend, Adam Zeller of the AVP Galaxy Network and co-host of the AVP Galaxy Podcast. Adam, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me back on.
Anytime, and this is like the perfect time to do it because in the last few weeks, we've finally gotten through all of the spoilers, all of the TikTok and Instagram giveaways that people have been doing with the plot and the story of the latest release of Alien Romulus. And you got to speak to the man himself, which we'll get to later. But yeah, I figured we would do what I'm calling a cult-worthy check-in. We're going to check in with where the pop culture pulse is of fans of the Alien franchise, what the AVP Galaxy community thinks of this latest film, but also I want to go back. I want to talk about how each release has kind of, had some significance to how this franchise has evolved over the last almost 50 years now and to where it is now, and the hits and the misses. And I think at the end of the day, this is a franchise just can't be killed, right? Like, we've got good movies, we've got questionable movies. Some people say we've got bad movies, but there are still Alien films being made despite the fact that Disney owns the franchise now. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, this year was the 45th anniversary of the original Alien, and it was awesome seeing that again in theaters. 20th Century Studios did a one-day event for that, showing a little sneak peek of Romulus, a little behind the scenes. So it does feel like the Alien franchise, it's just part of the pop culture lexicon now in terms of sci-fi. And regardless if some of the movies don't quite land with fans or with audiences, I think you're right. I think it's pretty unkillable. Like, they'll always come back to it and try again. But I feel like with the release of Romulus, it's just been such an exciting time for us because we've never seen like marketing to this extent, where they have like people with face huggers on the streets and in the theater lobbies and stuff. And the movie's just done phenomenally well. I believe it just passed $300 million internationally. It's either approaching or has passed $100 million domestically. And this was a smaller budget Alien film compared to the last two, compared to Prometheus and Covenant. So I think it's a really exciting time for the franchise. It feels like this movie did for Alien what Prey did for Predator. Just like Covenant didn't really land, had a big second weekend drop-off. The Predator, the Shane Black film in 2018, was also not well received at all. And Prey kind of rescued that franchise a bit, and I feel like Romulus has maybe done the same thing for Alien.
I think so too. And I did have my issues and reservations about Romulus when it came to story, but I've already been on a couple podcasts discussing it. I think when it came to the presentation and the preservation of the character itself, of this entity, I think that's at the end of the day what the fans really care about. Because we've seen all these different like soft sequels and reboots over the last 20 years that the characters are totally disposable. It doesn't matter how big of a star you have in the film. We want the creature. We want the science. We want the lore. So it doesn't really matter if the characters bring it to the table if you're not going to have Ripley as your central character. But I got to admit that Romulus did surprise me because it is the very first Alien film since Resurrection that has a character that I actually really wanted to see more of and cared about the stakes and cared about the outcome. And that was Andy the android. Like, I think that to me, Carol Spady who played Rain, I liked her as well. And I think they make an excellent combo. I'm worried to see if this movie does get a sequel, if it's going to be savable, salvageable if we split them up. Because I feel like the two of them really created a chemistry and a sense of wanting that character dynamic to go on and not just be one film and then washed away. Because we kind of got that with the Prometheus Covenant, where we're attaching ourselves to a central character, and it ended up being David in those, which I thought was an interesting choice because it's like following Darth Vader through the Star Wars films instead of a Skywalker, or instead of a protagonist with a rebellion, you're following the villain. And I liked that twist, but I wasn't sure if it was sustainable, where I think this model might be the one. I don't know. That's my opinion. What do you think about that?
Yeah, it would be interesting if we do end up getting a direct sequel to Romulus, given that the prequels had a new cast of characters, except for David, of course, but it was many years later, and he had kind of changed as a character, I feel like, between those two movies.
Mhm.
So if we did get a direct continuation of Rain and Andy, yeah, that dynamic, I think, was a core part of why Romulus worked for a lot of general audiences. Me as a fan, I think among the fans, it was a bit more divisive, honestly. The general vibe of fans has been positive. Like on our website, we held a poll, and I believe it was about 70%. It was either like 5 stars or 4 stars. So definitely less divisive than the prequels, I would say. So I think the chances of a direct sequel to this, given how well it's done, are high, and that would be interesting. But at the same time, I feel like some of the one of the interesting aspects of the Alien films is each one, at least the first four, had a different director, and each one had its own kind of unique vibe. So I don't know how it would be just getting a direct sequel with the same director, the same characters, because we haven't had that really ever in the Alien franchise. So that would be interesting to see if we get that in the years to come.
I mean, I think that, Ridley Scott was just trying to capture too much of the original magic in a bottle when he did Prometheus and Covenant back to back. But also, there was that sense of like trying to reinvent himself again in that sequel, trying to step away from Prometheus. And I think one of the main constraints about Romulus is the fact that we as fans, and I follow your guys' podcast and I follow the network and the forums really closely. Like we as fans were ready for a reboot of that and kind of get away from the Prometheus lore. And I feel that the parts of the movie of Romulus that really were a downside to me was trying to kind of connect to the Prometheus movies. And I wasn't sure I was all for that. Like I was really ready for the soft reboot where we were going to detach ourselves from that lore and at the same time kind of fill in a gap between, the first Alien film and Aliens, which I think it did really well. But once we reintroduced that Prometheus stuff into it, it kind of lost me. So I think that the big wild card here is that we do have a TV show coming out next year. And we could see what that does with the lore and the mythology. We kind of know it's set on Earth. We kind of know that it's a semi prequel. But I don't know. Like, do you think we are we treading on the waters that, let's say, DC is doing with their comics right now, where we're going to oversaturate the IP? Because right now, with how many Batmans have we had in the last 10 years? And now we have like a Joker side movie that gets its sequel as well. I feel like we're playing in the same waters. Do you think that this TV show is going to maybe muddle the excitement that people had for Romulus and maybe misdirect its fans and maybe misdirect the franchise? Is there any concern about that in your world?
I think there's definitely concern because it is a project that's wholly unique from Alien Romulus. There was no coordination between these two projects. Holly's been trying to get this series off the ground for a long time, and originally 20th Century Fox didn't want to go for it, and then they had new leadership after the Disney acquisition, and they decided to move forward with it under FX. I know Ridley Scott does not really have any significant creative involvement with the series other than he just has his executive producer role, and honestly, I think that's a good thing. And from some of the things
Right.
Holly has said, it seems like it will be really disregarding the prequels in terms of the origin of the xenomorph in particular. So I'm interested to see where he goes with that. I do know a few things about the series. that maybe I'm not supposed to. But so it'll be interesting to see how Noah Hawley pulls that off, because I do think while Romulus was very much a back to basics kind of, spook house alien movie,
Mhm.
Noah Hawley's series is going to be much more experimental, much more weird. But he does have a good track record. Legion
Yeah.
and Fargo have been really well
Fargo.
received. I think this is the biggest production series he's ever done. You have to think that 20th Century Studios has some concern over, what he's doing, and will not just let him do whatever. But then again, maybe they will, and maybe it'll be better for it. So
I think with the Prey situation is the fact that we are, regretful that it did not get a theatrical release, but I think that it did inspire confidence in the studio to give more attention to Romulus. Like, if people can show up and show appreciation for a Predator film that has no major stars, in fact, creates a lot of buzz around these relatively unknown people, and being able to transform the lore a little bit, it showed that the audiences were going to be accepting of something a little bit different. And I think that's where Romulus really does show, is that it took things that we were getting excited about in the alien lore, like the idea that alien isolation, I think, is a huge influence on the aesthetic of Alien Romulus, like the technology, the base, the hallway, the general set decor and art direction feels very similar to Isolation, which I think is a great thing, because it's like when we saw in the Star Wars movie, the Rogue One, where we got to see some of like the retro Star Wars, like the retro future technology. It kind of got us excited, because I think one of the things that a lot of people complained about was how the prequels looked so much more futuristic and glossy. And we wanted to return to the more, hey, this was more practical. This was built out of machinery and not all glossy techno tech screens. That's one of my biggest complaints with Prometheus is, if it's so many years before the events of Alien, why does everything look so much better and technologically progressive? That was always a concern of mine. And Romulus did it. Romulus made me feel like I was back in the Nostromo, Weyland-Yutani era of that film. It felt very tangible. Everything was kind of mechanical and analog. I loved that. And I think that was like a real service to the fans. But at the same time, one of my other biggest complaints about Romulus is that maybe it did too much fan service and took away from what it was trying to build as a story with these characters. What's your guys' point of view on that end?
yeah, as far as the retro, the like lo-fi sci-fi tech, it was great to see that kind of re-implemented into the series. And you could tell Fede was definitely inspired by Alien Isolation with that. I mean, he had said playing that game was one of the inspirations that he got to spur him on to make an Alien movie. I think it was cool to see some modern pieces of technology shown in that like clunky retro context. Like Rain has a video watch she's using to talk to Tyler. Something we haven't really seen in the Alien universe before, but it still feels like those old retro watches, even though like a video watch is kind of a modern piece of technology. And the same thing with I think one of the characters early on was on like a handheld gaming device, which kind of looked like a Steam Deck or something, but it still felt very retro. So there was a
Yeah.
really great and unique aesthetic style where I think you still had pieces of technology that were relatable for a modern audience, but aesthetically they felt very much in line with the original Alien and Aliens. And as a fan, yeah, those were some complaints with the prequels, that everything looked slick with holograms and stuff. And maybe you could headcanon that out to, well, this is like the top of the line of the Weyland fleet, and this is a new colony vessel, and this other tech is like a pretty much a semi truck in space, so it's not quite as advanced. But there is a pretty big disparity between the tech in the prequels and the original films for sure. And so it is nice to see some of that retro feel reintroduced, I think. And Isolation was definitely an influence in that. And that's been well received among the fans. I think they eat that up, the retro tech, because it's a unique aesthetic of Alien. It's something Blade Runner does too, I think.
Mhm.
Maybe it pushes that a little bit further than Alien, I would say, because you still want to have some relatability with the tech that, hey, this is far in the future, and we still want to kind of imagine this would be plausible, right? Or I think a Blade Runner, at this point, it's like alternate reality kind of thing.
Right, because we're already past what the original year that Blade Runner was supposed to be taking place in. So, no, I agree. So, what I'd like to do now is, as we continue this conversation, I think we should go back through the Alien films, even the versus Predator ones, and kind of think about where it has progressed the franchise in like the cultural wavelength. Because I think if there's one thing I can say about the quadrilogy is like you already mentioned, they've had different filmmakers, and most of them were like visual auteurs. They weren't your everyday worksman director that could direct editing like comedies and romantic comedies. These were people that were real visualists and stylists and have gone on to make great names for themselves. And it's interesting that, those names were kind of built on the back of the Xenomorph, on the back of this franchise. So I think one of the things that one of the things about the original film, the 1979 Ridley Scott one, is the fact that coming right off of the heels of Star Wars and coming out the same year as Star Trek The Motion Picture, I felt like it really had to break new ground in how acceptable science fiction was going to be for a more mature audience. Because we had seen a few science fiction films that were more mature in their message. I think Silent Running with Bruce Stern is kind of like that. It's not a sci-fi movie for kids. It's got an ecological message, yet Black Hole for Disney was a little bit more kid-friendly. You've got Star Wars and Star Trek, and here is a movie about space truckers fighting a creature that essentially inhabits them, gestates inside them, bursts out and takes them out one by one, violently and dark and spookily. I think that was like a real introduction to an alien sci-fi horror film that we really hadn't seen yet, in the sense of the amount of quality and respect given to the production, not like a Roger Corman creature skin flick. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it felt like very much a B type movie done in an A way, in terms
Yeah.
of just the talent you had involved. These people that almost got the Jodorowsky's Dune film off the ground came back together. You had H.R. Giger, Ron Cobb, top designers with Dan O'Bannon and Ron Chachette, and putting together this world that felt very relatable, I think, for audiences at the time, because they were so used to seeing, like you were saying, sci-fi in a very romanticized, adventurous context. And this one was more so in the boring day jobs of people who are thrown into this extreme survival situation, but also showing this really interesting grand world with like the scenes we got with the derelict ship that made the universe very mysterious and alluring, I think, for audiences. And to speak to something you had brought up before that I meant to respond to, I do feel like with Prey, Disney were probably regretting not giving that a theatrical release, just with the level of reception that movie got. And so Romulus was meant for Hulu. And they decided right before filming started that they would give this a theatrical release. And now that has really paid off for them. And director Dan Trachtenberg, who did Prey, is in New Zealand shooting the next Predator film right now. So he's getting his big theatrical Predator release. So it'll be interesting to see how that goes. But yeah, I do feel like Alien was pretty groundbreaking for the time, in just the way it presented science fiction in a very new, grounded, relatable way.
And it definitely had its share of copycats, and like the like you said, like the B movie done in an A way. Then you had the B movies doing their B movie and sometimes C grade way of a great film. So, for example, the film Creature, The Terror Within is another Alien ripoff. These are all like B movies from that era that really try to jump off of the back that Alien did, because these guys were already making these kind of movies, but they weren't giving them that kind of quality and that kind of grandeur or the stars. And it was the perfect thing to do that. And even though I think they're laughable, there's some fun to it. But what it does is it keeps that idea of that kind of sci-fi horror from mature audiences in the zeitgeist until studios recognize that, hey, maybe we should let James Cameron do a sequel to this film. Let's stop letting these, B studios and these grindhouse studios make these films and piggyback off the success of Alien and actually build off the success of Alien for real. And there was that struggle too, because Sigourney Weaver wasn't sure about coming back. And that was a conversation that had to be had. It's like, can we do this without Ripley? Again, it's a very classic structure of we have a final girl. It's a slasher move, but this final girl was more impactful culturally than the final girls that we'd seen in the slasher movies before, because this was a grandeur production. So bringing her back for part 2, I think, was kind of crucial, and in a way, it really set the stage to have strong female leads in action flicks. What do you think?
Yeah, definitely. And with Aliens, she got an Oscar nomination for Best Actress, which was
Right.
pretty unheard of at the time for science fiction. And Aliens really turned it into a franchise. Alien was, a masterpiece pretty much. But Aliens is what I think gave the series its staying power and its fandom that it has today. Just elements you have in there, like the Colonial Marines, like James Cameron just knows how to do an awesome thrill ride blockbuster film, and that's exactly what he did with Aliens. And I believe there was some studio hesitation for the second film until he did Terminator, and then they gave him his shot in doing Aliens. And yeah, that production had its tension between him and the crew as well. So there's a lot of interesting stories behind the development of Aliens. There's actually a book, um, The Making of Aliens by J.W. Rinsler. He also did a making of the first film. Unfortunately, the author's passed away, but there's some of the best books you can read on the making of the first 2 films. But yeah, I do feel that Aliens, that's where it really took off.
It was able to capture a wider audience too, because while the first one is considered like a sci-fi horror movie, now you are bringing the action audience into the world of the xenomorphs. So there are horror and terror elements and definitely sci-fi, but it really works as like an action war movie too. You've got Marines, you've got war lingo, you've got great firepower, you've just got those bombastic scenes that, James Cameron really just did kind of pave the way for future action directors like Michael Bay's and stuff like that. Like they wouldn't be those guys if Cameron wasn't there first doing what he did. And also I think he did write Rambo First Blood Part 2 in the interim between Terminator and Alien. So that kind of did show that he also knew how to write big blockbuster cheese for productions that he wasn't in charge of. And that's great because it builds your clout as a writer and as a guy that can be trusted with a franchise like this. And maybe that is to the detriment of the franchise for some people, because now that you've built this big blockbuster action movie with an incredible set piece and incredible ending, like I don't think, in my personal opinion, that any of the Alien films since Aliens has been able to recreate the energy that is in that climax of that second film. When it comes to the action set piece, when it comes to the drama and the high stakes and the performance, and even if it's practical puppet special effects that looked so real, none of the films have been able to emulate that. And in a way, some of them haven't even really tried because they know that they can't recreate it. We've seen them throw some wordplay and homages to it, but I don't think any of them top it. Which brings me to Alien 3. Like, I think Alien 3, and we've talked about this in the podcast before. We did an episode on Alien 3 during its anniversary about how it had such a tumultuous gestation process, going from several writers and conceptualists and directors. We had Vincent Ward was one, and then we had Rennie Harlin, who got fired, and bringing in David Fincher on his first feature film. It's just it was a troubled production from the beginning. And I think that actually kind of adds to the charm of it in my way, is that it does feel like it wasn't an easy production and it's not an easy film. And I think that is why it does have its certain followers like me, that we didn't come for the gloss of Aliens. We actually came for something dingier, and that's exactly what it gave us.
Yeah, Alien 3 is definitely one of the most, if not the most dark and nihilistic movies in the franchise. I guess a lot of fans just instantly turned against that right after the intro of the film, because these characters they had grown to love with Aliens, spoilers if you Haven't seen
Right.
that movie in 20, 30 years. Um, were offed immediately, and a lot of people after the relationship dynamic between Ripley, Newt, and Hicks just immediately turned against the film with that. So there's arguments to be made against the film for that for sure, in terms of how well this is going to go over with audiences.
Mm.
I feel like Alien 3 though has over the years it has definitely gained a cult following and way more of an appreciation. And I think a big part of that was its re-release in the Alien Quadrilogy DVD set in 2003. And as part of that set, there was a new edit of the film done by documentarian Charles de Lazarica, and he put together what's known as the assembly cut of the film, and I do feel like it really helps the film. So it's a movie that the director David Fincher doesn't really like to talk about, but it's one you have to wonder if the studio had just given him a bit more freedom to do his thing and not had such a rushed production, because you could definitely see with the behind the scenes materials we have of that movie how stressed and how unhappy he was with the studio during that shoot. So it makes you wonder if the studio had just, I know David Fincher was the first time movie director and they didn't know he was going to become the David Fincher, but it makes you wonder what it could have been if they had just given him that space to do his thing. But I also feel like it's something where franchise building wasn't as big of a thing back then. You just had movie studios wanting to do their trilogy and cap it, and that's it. So they wanted an ending to the story. But, it wasn't long after that, then we started getting rumors of the Star Wars prequels. And that's when I think the franchise building really took off in the studios. And we get Alien Resurrection in 1997, not too long after.
Which, again, we've talked about this on the show too. It definitely has a cult following and a rediscovery and a reemergence. And it is the art house Alien for sure. We've got Jean-Pierre Jeunet directing, hot off of doing City of Lost Children and Delicatessen. And that is one of the things that I think really confused a lot of people, is that here's a film that actually brought whimsy for the first time to the Alien franchise. And I think that is palatable for some and distasteful for others, because we start seeing a little bit of comedy, but we also start seeing the lack of nihilism. In a sense, it very coincides with Starship Troopers, which came out the same year, where we're kind of seeing like a cynical, almost satirical mockery of military and of capitalism and all that stuff like that in this film. And it's played with a little bit more of a whimsical sense and more tongue in cheek. I mean, the fact that you have performances like Brad Dourif's in this film, where he is just chewing the scenery Hannibal Lecter style, I love it, but it doesn't feel right to some in an Alien film. The fact that we've got Ripley doing the basketball trick and we got Ron Perlman hamming it up. Joss Whedon kind of brings that comedy to the script. I'm not sure if that is exactly what the intent was, but when you have those kind of colorful characters mixed in with the colorful direction and art design that Jeunet was known for, it was going to be very, very different than what people were expecting. And like we talked about in that episode, it was too different for some.
Yeah, I definitely did not like it the first time I watched it, but it's really grown on me through the years. I appreciate Alien Resurrection a lot now, and I find it to be a really fun watch, especially after Alien 3 with how dark that movie was. Alien Resurrection does take itself less seriously, but I feel like it still feels like a worthy entry in the series. Um, Granted, you have to, I guess, think about how fans of the series would have felt about this, them bringing it back, and this is what they get. So we have a much wider context, I think, to look at the movie now, than maybe we did in '97. I think it has beautiful cinematography. I think the score is great, and the performances, the dynamic between Sigourney Weaver and Winona Ryder, I think was super interesting in that movie. How she wasn't the Ripley we knew before, but she had this different side to her as this kind of hybrid between a human and an alien. I mean, mostly human character. So I really enjoy the movie now. I know writer Joss Whedon has expressed displeasure on pretty much everything they did with his screenplay on that one. But yeah, I feel like Alien Resurrection is definitely not schlock. I mean, maybe it is a little bit, but uh, it certainly has its own unique identity, and it is a fun alien movie to watch.
I think that's the one that kind of got people off of the Alien train for a little while, because it's interesting to me that, in was it 2004 or 2005 that we got Alien versus Predator?
Oh, four.
2004, so we're 7 years removed from the Alien franchise, essentially. We've closed it off. We've got the quadrilogy out there on VHS. I had it. And then, the initial DVD set of the quadrilogy too. But we weren't seeing a lot of Alien stuff out in the zeitgeist. It wasn't out in the world. Alien versus Predator video game was in arcades and it was on some consoles, but it wasn't something that was like big amongst the public. It was definitely a fan service thing. We had novelizations, we had comic books, and this was the days before comic books could build a massive movie franchise like it does now. They weren't sifting through the pages of comic books to find the next big thing. So with Alien versus Predator coming out, especially with who was doing it, I think that was a bigger gamble than any of the Alien movies before, because now you've got two audiences and you've got a director that was already kind of known in the industry and in the fan circles of being a little campy, being a little hammy. Resident Evil with, Paul W.S. Anderson directing is who we're talking about. Resident Evil was kind of the same thing, where were we really fans of that movie, or were we just grateful to have a Resident Evil movie? And it made just enough money to keep making like 10 of them. That's the big question, right? Now, I did like his film Event Horizon. I felt that was the movie that kind of showed what he could be capable of. And I think the biggest downfall of Alien versus Predator for me is the fact that that is not what we got. Instead, we got a PG-13 rated, sanitized version of two of the most violent characters in sci-fi history, put together and made for audiences that wanted that kind of gore and violence, and we didn't get it. What do you think?
Yeah, the PG-13 issue was definitely a major point of contention among fans. I mean, I remember on our website when it was reported on that the film would be PG-13, it was met with overwhelming negative reception among fans, and perhaps they maybe over course corrected with the next AVP film. But yeah, a lot of fans didn't know how to feel about the choice of director Paul Anderson. I mean, Mortal Kombat was also another big hit of his from the 90s, but uh, Event Horizon, I feel like even at the time was a pretty respected sci-fi horror film. So a lot of fans, I think, were looking at that and feeling maybe encouraged from that movie. I have always liked AVP. It has been divisive among fans, but I feel like it did pretty well at the box office at the time.
Yeah.
Um, and I think I just love the production design and the practical effects and the CG effects in that movie. That's one of those early 2000 movies that we got, like Jurassic Park 3 is kind of the same vein, right? Where you have all these different effects types merged together, playing with each other and firing on all cylinders. Like you have miniatures with the boat and the helicopter and the pyramid. You have amazingly built sets. You have people in Alien and Predator suits. You have CG aliens. You have miniature aliens. And so I think some of those strong effects that you had mentioned from Aliens, it did bring some of those techniques back, but it was also aided with CG technology now that could make more realistic kind of animal characters with CGI. So I have always loved the first AVP movie. Yeah, it's got its issues for sure. I wish it wasn't PG-13. Um, I think you maybe could have had more character development in that film, and maybe some of the director's choices with that could have been different. But overall, I find it a solid, fun movie. And as far as like the first kind of big versus movie we got with these franchises, it could have gone a lot worse, I think.
Oh, I agree.
And a year before, we had Freddy versus Jason, which I actually didn't see until quite recently. But I thought that was great. And that showed, I think, you could have a successful horror versus movie. And I think that was probably a more successful one than AVP.
Well, what I respect about the studio's foresight, and maybe it was accidental, I don't know, But being able to kind of keep those two films separated from the main franchise in case they ever wanted to go back, I feel like there was a very clever technique done to this where it's like, okay, we're going to put it back in modern day. We've got the predators, we got the aliens. We are going to have a nice, cool, like little way of saying, hey, this used to be like a training ground, right? A proving ground. And it kind of does feed into, we were in the very early stages of people being into like the ancient culture, ancient aliens, prehistory, essentially, what's going on in Antarctica. There was a lot of that in there too that people are like talking about like as religion now. I think that's kind of cool. But going on to Alien versus Predator Requiem, which, dude, to me, that is like the biggest question mark of the whole entire franchise. Like, how do we get that movie? We didn't have a whole lot of love for AVP, so why are we doubling down and making a very graphic and more violent and outlandish sequel to that film that mostly takes place like in a small town, high school, hospital? Like, it's an interesting way to make that film. Yet there are people that kind of respect some of it. For me, I like the idea of having that kind of small town horror film with creatures. I think I would have enjoyed that film a lot more if it wasn't aliens and predators. If it was just like a monster movie, come up with the original idea instead of working it into the franchise. But I also think that the character design is cool, just like AVP was. Like, that's where I say that this franchise can't be killed, is because we just want to see the monster. And sometimes we don't care what the story is or what the package that they're delivering the monster is in. You've kind of spoken a little bit highly of Requiem in the past. So let's kind of refresh on where you stand on that.
Yeah, I've always kind of been a defender of AVPR. Since I first saw it, I came out of the theater really enjoying it, and I was surprised, honestly, when I got back. Well, maybe not totally surprised, but I went back on our forum on AVP Galaxy and saw everyone just hated it, like hated its guts, really. And but yeah, to me, it kind of played into that small town America sci-fi horror setting, like we'd get with something like The Blob or something like that. Or,
Right.
I've always loved the Resident Evil series as well, and it did feel very like Raccoon City, small town in a mountainous forest setting. And Colorado looks a lot like Utah, so to me, it was kind of like this whole like, wow, it's like they're right here where I live, kind of
Yeah,
thing.
right.
So there was an interesting in terms of the setting that it took place. I found that to be um, really effective for me personally. I know a lot of people did not like that. They didn't like seeing this outbreak in society because they're like, well, it totally makes the alien films not work. And yeah, maybe that's true. Because you nuke American City, like how is that going to affect
Right.
everything? And I know they had their ideas for that with a sequel that they never ended up doing, the Strauss brothers. Daniel Pearl actually filmed that AVPR. He was the cinematographer, and he was very unhappy with the color correction that was done to the film he shot.
Yeah, it's
We've
dark.
Yeah, it was very dark, and we've spoken with Liam O'Donnell, who's the director of the new Skyline sequels, which were much better received than the original Skyline, which was actually by the same directors of AVPR.
Right.
And he has reached out to Daniel Pearl recently to try and maybe get a 4K re-release of this done, where it has the intended color correction. Because I know the cinematographer was very confused as to why they ended up going that dark with the film, and it's one of the first things people complain about when they talk about AVPR. And I think if you were to see a newly released cut where people could see what's going on, um, maybe they would soften up on the movie a bit. Yeah, I know the characters are not super well developed, but I just thought it was an effective horror survival film, like something you just throw on in Halloween. I
Yeah.
feel like the first AVP is objectively a better movie, but AVPR, and yeah, it did feel like it was definitely trying to be exploitative with the pregnant women and everything like that, and it was just trying to be edgy for the sake of it. But um, I don't know. It kind of reminded me of a grindhouse style film, and seeing, so just kind of intentionally schlocky and edgy, and I thought it was a unique context to have these characters in. But I can see why it didn't go over well with most people, for sure. It's just something I personally enjoy, and I'm sure we all have those movies that most people hate, but for some reason we seem to like.
Well, and I've always compared it to Return of the Living Dead, Dan O'Bannon's film from back in the 80s, where you do have like this small town America. You've do got the colorful characters, and something happens to the small town and it gets nuked at the end. I feel that's kind of, where it was trying to go. And I've said before on my show many times where I will not own a physical media copy of anything if I don't ever intend on rewatching it. And I got to tell you right now, I do not have Paul W.S. Anderson's AVP on my shelf, but I've got Requiem and I've watched it several times and I will rewatch it because it is exactly what you just described. It fits into the wheelhouse that my brain works in when it comes to entertainment. It's not high quality. I'm not expecting it to be high quality, but I get a kick out of it. I get a kick out of the spoilers, Predator, Xenomorph hybrid. I think it's great. I think it's something that really was like made for the fans of like, what if? It's a what if movie. What if this did happen? What if these two characters did come together? And what if it did have a hybrid? What would it look like? What would that boss look like if this was a video game? What's that final battle? I think it kind of feeds that kind of energy, but at the same time, it does pull us out of the lore that was built. It pulls us out of the IP. So when we do finally get to Prometheus in 2012, they really, I'm not going to even say went back to basics. They wanted just to kind of like hard stop and reboot the entire universe, but still connect it to the original. And that was a big problem with me because I was following that film since its early inception in like '05 or '06 when I started seeing little leaks of the scripts and were they real or were they fake? And sometimes I was surprised of how much of the fake stuff I was reading actually ended up in, if not Prometheus, in Covenant. I mean, it's an interesting thing because we didn't really have the internet forums for the original quadrilogy, but we did for this one, and we had all the speculation and all the false flags, and it was really interesting to see like, okay, what were they going to do with Space original script, and you bring in the Lost guy, Damon Lindelof, into it, and what was he going to change it to? And I feel a lot of people that say that was a detriment of bringing him in and changing what was already there into like this weird, we don't even know what it is. It's just something new, something different, and the whole movie is essentially a conundrum. We are not supposed to understand it. Even the ending, we don't really understand the how or the why. We just have to kind of speculate it. So I think it did divide audiences more than any Alien a film in the franchise, in my opinion. What do you think?
Yeah, oddly enough, it's still the most successful film in the franchise ever. And I think
because we waited for it for so long.
Yeah, I think it was just a big return to sci-fi for Ridley Scott. He had not done that genre for a long time, and the hype for Prometheus was insane. Like the trailer was just so good.
One of the best trailers ever. I agree.
Yeah, but yeah, it was very divisive, I think, among fans when it came out, and it was one of those movies where I walked out of and I was like, I don't know how I feel about that. And then I think about it more and more on the way home, and I was like, I did not like that movie, but it sucks because I really want to like that movie.
Yeah.
Like, if you had told me Ridley Scott's coming back to do an Alien prequel, like right when I was getting into the franchise, I would have been like, holy shit, like that's going to be the greatest thing ever. And it was so weird to me because it was in the Alien universe, but it felt very much its own thing. I think I do have like a love-hate relationship with Prometheus because I think as a standalone sci-fi film, it works. And it's beautifully shot. Ridley Scott can't make a bad-looking movie. It has amazing production design. The cast is pretty good, I would say. The acting is definitely solid. But I feel like the movie kind of meanders a lot, where they end up just going back and forth from the ship to the structure. People make really nonsensical decisions in that movie.
We know this. Yeah.
And yeah, I think when Ridley Scott was developing the script with Damon Lindelof, Lindelof had mentioned the first AVP film, like, hey, there's this guy Wayland who was in this AVP film, and Ridley Scott just gave him a deadpan stare, and then he did not mention that again. But yeah, that's where the AVP films, which the first one at least originally did try and make itself fit into Alien canon, and Prometheus was just like, screw that, we're just gonna do something completely different. And I think for a lot of Alien fans, including myself, it really hurt the mystery of the space jockey by its portrayal of the engineers, because that was such a core element of the original film, so ominous and imposing, that to have this sort of retcon that's like, oh no, that wasn't like this ancient fossilized being, this Lovecraftian thing. That was an albino human that we happen to have been like created from, and that was just a suit. And so to me, that really, I think, harmed one of the core things about the Alien franchise for me, which was the space jockey in that original film. I think it's fine to explore that in expanded media, but I really wasn't satisfied with the vision Ridley Scott had for that element of the Alien franchise. But how about you? What did you think about Prometheus?
It was, to me, and I've said this before, the biggest cinematic disappointment of my life until I saw Alien Covenant. But like, because I'd followed it so much, I'd followed it for so long, and I was really excited to see like what they were going to bring to the universe. And I wasn't even expecting to see a xenomorph. In fact, I didn't want to see one. I wanted just to see something based in the same universe that connected to the space jockey. The black goo, I think, was just such a terrible MacGuffin for this entire series, because it takes away from, like you said, the mystery of what this creature is. Why can't it just be a perfect organism? Why did it have to be created by an android or by a human's hand, essentially? Why does it have to go back and make us like the villain? The whole idea of the franchise, which people are, it's funny, like they're having the conversation now where it's always been the conversation in my world, is that Wayland Yutani is the villain. You know, the xenomorphs are just acting out of instinct. They are just organisms that are there to survive and procreate. They are bees, they are ants. They're terrifying and they're dangerous, but they're not the villain. And I feel like the esoteric and philosophical ways that Lindelof tried to weave that story together is really what kind of took me out of Prometheus. And then kind of doubling down on that in Covenant. And again, with the early talk about Covenant, it was supposed to correct the things that people didn't like about Prometheus. And instead, it kind of doubled down on them. And that pissed me off again. I don't even like to talk about Covenant. The only time I ever saw it was in the theater with you guys. And I was just like, wow, I really did not like this movie. I did not like the red herrings. I've never seen so many red herrings in a film that sadly will never get answered, you know, because I think they're over and done with that chapter of the franchise. But yeah, to me, those two films, I mean, Prometheus is the better film, and it is on my shelf because I wanted to see all the special features behind it. But yeah, I think that those two, Ridley Scott tried to outdo himself, and I think he would have been much better served if he would have just played the hits. It's okay to play the hits sometimes, right? Like, I think James Cameron would probably shock the hell out of people if he went back and made a lo-fi Terminator movie instead of all these big Avatar movies that keep trying to build and outdo each other. Like, sometimes just go back and play the hits would be, I'd say.
Yeah, Covenant, I also have a love-hate relationship with that film because there are a lot of things I like about it. It's very much kind of the Island of Dr. Moreau vibe in the Alien universe. And it is a very gothic feeling movie. So I do love the visuals, even though seeing this ancient dark necropolis, like Roman style city, feels out of place for the space jockey again, but it is a unique setting to see these creatures in. I thought it was interesting how, just a random point here, but how Ridley Scott recreated that old painting that Giger once paid homage to, the Isle of the Dead, in the movie. So it had its unique artistic moments like that, and I did kind of like the dynamic between David and Walter. So but yes, Covenant to me was ultimately a disappointment. I had kind of come to terms with that disappointment from Prometheus, but I had seen The Martian in 2016, which Ridley Scott directed, and I thought that was great. I was like, oh man, maybe he's really getting back into sci-fi now. We'll see what happens with Covenant. So I was ready to give it a fair shot, but it just felt like it didn't work as a sequel to Prometheus, and it also didn't work as a prequel to Alien, unfortunately. I did like the cast: Annie McBride, Catherine Waterston. I think the cast worked better than Prometheus. They were a bit more relatable. It
I will
still had the
agree.
same issue of them doing really idiotic things in that movie. So really did not learn from that. And it's funny that was a very odd time for us as fans in the Alien franchise, because that was when the Alien social media channels really started to have more fan interaction and engagement. That's when like the whole Alien Day started, was around then. It was 2016 on the lead up to Covenant. And so there was a lot of just online hype for Covenant. And Ridley Scott was talking like he was going to do 3 more prequels after Covenant before it was going to
I
go into the back
remember.
end of Alien.
Yeah, I
And then
remember.
Covenant, it had an all right opening weekend, but it had a historic drop on its second weekend. And I think the movie, Ridley's heart just wasn't in it. And I have to wonder if he just compromised with the studio in terms of having the xenomorph in this, because he's obviously more interested in David and in AI, um, to, I guess, not get Neil Blomkamp's Alien 5 made, which was in development at this time and it looked like it was going to be made. And Blomkamp has spoken to that, saying his project unraveled once Ridley came on board. So I'm sure there was a lot of behind the scenes politics there that prevented his movie from happening. And I'll always be curious about that movie, because that would have been the big return of Sigourney Weaver and Michael Biehn. But my friend Mike Monahan, who has a YouTube channel, Mike's Monsters, did a big, I guess, chronicle of all the things we found out about Alien 5. And he also explained some insider knowledge he had heard. And that movie would have had some pretty wacky ideas, I think. So maybe it is for the best we didn't get that, although I have liked Neil Blomkamp's films and I would have loved to have seen what he would have done with Alien.
I think it would have been something very similar to Resurrection, where now we are kind of playing with the legend and the lore and what we can do with these creatures. I mean, honestly, dude, I never thought that we were going to see trained velociraptors in the Jurassic Park world, but we did, and then some in the stupid sequels. So I don't think anything is off the table these days, where I think people will at least give something a shot. And I think that Disney Fox has realized how important this franchise, especially this figurehead of the xenomorph and that lore behind it, how important it is to the fans. And they're going to make sure that, I think they're going to handle it with kid gloves from now on, where they're going to give it to people that really respect it. Fede Alvarez, I think, was a really great choice for this. There were things that he did in Romulus that I wasn't a fan of, but I can't say that he did not make a Fede Alvarez movie. He did, 100%. If you've seen his other movies, you saw that he stuck to his guns on pretty much everything that movie represents. And I can't fault or shame a director for doing that. I think that's really important. What we did not see is a very hacky, cliche film from a director that doesn't really care about the material or the lore. They just want it to look cool. I think the Bad Boys movies is a perfect example of that, where it's all flashbang, want to look like Michael Bay, but not be Michael Bay. And it just takes away from what was so special about the first two. And I feel if they do make any more theatrical versions of this franchise, if it's not with him and if it's someone else, just let them cook. Like, pick them for what they've brought already. Use that as their baseline for what they're going to do with it. And just make sure that we're not going too outlandish with this franchise and with these characters. But again, like I said, even if they do, I don't think you can kill it. I think they'll just keep going back and going back and going back until something lands. But regardless if you enjoyed Romulus or not, there's no denying that it is the canary in the coal mine that audiences are ready for more. They're more prepared for xenomorphs in the theater than they were 10 years ago, I think. I think they're in. They're bought in.
Yeah, it showed that the character had not faded into obscurity, that you can have the alien be scary again, just like Isolation showed. And it was one of the things I feel like Romulus did so well, was reintroducing the element of practical effects. I mean, it still had a lot of great CG at play also, and a lot of great just design work in general in terms of what the concept artist did for that movie. And a lot of concept art is showing up online now on websites like ArtStation that the artists are sharing, and it just shows like the care they had for this franchise during the pre-production and development of it. Yeah, I feel like Romulus has been a hit with audiences, and I feel like it'll introduce a new, younger generation into the franchise where they'll want to go back and see these movies that they maybe have not seen before. I think, and it's something that Fede talked to us about on our podcast. It's that he had to make a film that was accessible to a general audience while also trying to please the hardcore fans. And that's often a very difficult balance to achieve. I think Prey achieved it brilliantly. I think Romulus mostly achieved it. For me, I had my issues with Romulus as well. I liked it. I don't know if I loved it, but I can't deny how successful it's been. And it definitely didn't make me pull my hair out like I did with Prometheus and Covenant. So I'm very happy about that. I do wish, like Alien Isolation, it was completely divorced from the prequels, but I feel like Fede probably felt an obligation, given Ridley kind of gave him the shot to make this movie, to at least acknowledge those prequels if Ridley won't get to continue them. Although there's a lot of, like, it feels like Alien's really having a moment and being part of the film conversation, especially on X, formerly Twitter, recently. And I've seen people call for Ridley Scott's conclusion to the trilogy, because that second prequel left it on quite a big cliffhanger. And honestly, a sadistic part of me wants to just let him do it, because we all know David's going to be the space jockey and all the fans are going to hate it, and then they'll be completely against the prequels. So
we've been talking about that for years, dude.
yeah.
No, I think this is good. I think it's good to kind of like every once in a while, when a legacy sequel comes out or a film comes out that reintroduces new audiences to such a beloved franchise and such a beloved IP, to kind of put our finger on the cultural pulse of where it's at and where it could go. And that there's one thing that I think I'm excited to see in the next 10, 20, 30 years is, where are we taking this thing, you know? And if it doesn't mean that we're going to keep following the same characters from movie to movie, we don't need another Ripley. And I think that was one of my bigger complaints about this film, was like, okay, we kind of were creating another Ripley. Did we have to? I feel like we've already played that game. Let's play something a little bit different, right? And I think Andy is the big thing for that, because we went dark with the synthetics, and now we're going to, I'm not going to say the light side, but a side that we can actually connect with. And I think that was very crucial for this movie to work, is that we created a character that, for the most part, that type of character in the previous films was either a hero or a villain, and here was one that kind of skirted between both. And I think that was a very clever technique for us to have more character engagement. So that was a sidestep from the franchise that I was excited to see, that we were going to be a little bit more daring with the kind of characters we're going to bring into this franchise. But again, you're always going to have xenomorph fodder, right? You're always going to have hosts and chest bursters and all that stuff like that. So it played those parts just fine. But yeah, I'm really curious to see where they go with it.
Yeah, I know the director, Fede Alvarez, was asked on one of the red carpets by press, so when are you going to do an Alien versus Predator movie? And he was kind of laughing about it, but he's like, maybe I'll have to do that with my friend Dan Trachtenberg. We'll have to co-direct it, like From Dusk Till Dawn or something like that.
Right.
And I know he was probably just being flippant in the moment, but I'm sure that thought's probably actually on his mind. If Predator's in a much better place, and if Alien's in a much better place, I think that's the thing that's so frustrating for fans, is because even if most people disregard the AVP, both films, as not being successful, AVP has had amazing stories in the games, in the comics, in the books, and there's potential for that to work on screen, I think. And one of the biggest core elements of the Alien franchise, I feel, are the Colonial Marines, which have really only been featured in one film, Aliens. And I think that would be the perfect way to do an AVP3, is just set it in the future, make it feel like James Cameron's Aliens, and just throw a couple Predators in there. I think it could really work. And if you made it well, I think it could finally break the curse of the reputation of the AVP film.
Dude, just gave me like this weird nostalgia for the old AVP game on the Atari Lynx, where it let you choose to be a Colonial Marine, an alien, or a Predator. And that's, I'm like, why didn't we ever see that in a film? Well, you saw it in a game, and now you're talking about it. I'm like, that could be really cool. I got one last question for you before we close this conversation up, and that is, do you think that theatrical releases are crucial for the future success of the Alien franchise, or do you think this is something that can transition into the world of streaming, like we've seen other movies and intellectual properties do, where, you know, the streaming in series and long form content might be the place for this franchise? And would you be against that if the quality is good?
Well, that's an interesting question, because that's honestly what I expected after Prey. I was like, oh, we're just getting Alien and Predator stuff on Hulu now, and that's
Right.
how it's going to go. I was lucky enough to have seen Prey in a theater multiple times, and it was an awesome experience that I wish more people could have had. I still hope maybe they re-release Prey in theaters sometime. But it led to a real worry that we would never be able to put that movie on our shelf. Like, we didn't get a Blu-ray announcement until a year after that came out on Hulu. And I know that's a concern probably for people like you that have a bunch of Blu-ray movies behind you, is a lot of movies that have been released on streaming, they can just be pulled and they can become lost media, or media that's just inaccessible. And I'd never want that for these franchises. I do feel like maybe there's a place for some, we're going to get the Alien series on Hulu. So there you go. So if we do see a Predator series, or maybe an animated film or something like that, I think that could be an interesting avenue for that, to put it on streaming. But I think Romulus has shown that you'll have, and hopefully when the new Predator film comes out, I'm guessing next year, those two franchises will show that they still bring crowds to a theater. Maybe not always, because Covenant kind of had that drop. But if the word of mouth's there, if the marketing's there, and if the movie is actually good enough that people want to see it, I think those films will typically do well. The only thing I worry about is Disney is known for franchise building, but they are also known for running franchises into the ground. So hopefully that does not happen with these ones.
I agree. I think it's a great statement. So yeah, I guess we'll see. So please let people know where they can find your content, and some of the great people that you've talked to lately that were involved with Alien Romulus. I mean, the director himself. But yeah, so please let my audience know where they can find you.
Thanks. Yeah, if you want to follow me personally, I'm on X and Instagram as @RidgeTop21. But check out our website, avpgalaxy.net. We have editorials, news about the latest happenings in the franchises, reviews, and of course our podcast. And yeah, the podcast you mentioned where we interview the director is in the editing phase right now, and that should be releasing in the next couple of weeks here. We just had a big review podcast on Romulus where we went for 3 hours, so maybe that was too long, but we also talked to the guy that was in the xenomorph suit in Romulus, Trevor Newland, and that was an awesome conversation. We're about to interview Alec Gillis, who was responsible for some of the effects in Romulus. So yeah, check us out on pretty much any major podcasting service. We'll be on there. We're also on all the major socials: Facebook, X, Instagram, and YouTube.
Yep, and I'll have the links to those in the notes of this episode as well on the cultworthy.com and the Cultworthy Partners page. Yeah, great catching up and talking about the alien stuff. I know we talk about this kind of stuff all the time, but for the audience to hear what we talk about behind closed doors off the mic about what we think the franchise is doing and what it's going, I think is really exciting. So I can't thank you enough for this conversation. And everyone, you know what to do. Please like, listen, subscribe, rate 5 stars, not only to the Cultworthy Cinema podcast, but to the AVP Galaxy podcast as well. And we will see you next week.